What I really am sort of in the mood for is a girl with green eyes. And price is no object, Mrs. O'Toole. Fresh off the boats the way I like them. The more exotic, the better.
Chinese girls do not come with green eyes.
Well, Lo Pan knows better. Are the mysterious green-eyed people of Liqian in China the descendants of the lost Roman legion? Stay tuned to find out. The presence of green-eyed people and people with sandy-coloured hair has mystified locals in Gansu province and western China for centuries. Recently, Liqian made the news when tests revealed 2/3 of these green-eyed locals' DNA was in fact Caucasian in origin. This has led many to believe these were the descendants of the lost Roman legion of Crassus, Rome's wealthiest man, whose death is difficult to forget, and it went a little bit like this.
A crown for a king.
So first, let's look at the people of Western China in the Liqian region and try to work out why they think they have Roman DNA in them. The only story that we have that connects the Romans, which were far to the west of the map you're looking at now, and the Chinese in the Han Dynasty era is the Battle of Carrhae. Now, the Battle of Carrhae was in western Syria, and it was against the Parthian Empire, and we'll get to that bit later. But what we are looking at now is Central Asia, and more specifically, a battle between the Xiongnu and the Han, which took place further to the west of where they are on this map, in an area called Taraz. Now, Taraz is in modern-day Kazakhstan, and according to Han Chinese accounts of the battle, in which the Han fought King or Chieftain Zizi of the Xiongnu had about 100 men who looked different to everybody else. These men formed up in fish scale formation. It's been taken up by some historians that, in fact, these 100 men were Roman soldiers who had ended up far to the east after the Battle of Carrhae. This idea was put forward by Professor Homer Dubbs. His theory was that Roman POWs escaped or became mercenaries and ended up in the employment of the Xiongnu under Zizi. After Zizi lost the battle and lost his head, the 100 Roman soldiers, or the survivors of that group, were taken east to Liqian, and that's where their descendants now live. Okay, so let's have a look at what the Romans have to say about this. This all comes down to the political and financial ambitions of Marcus Linnæus Crassus. Marcus Linnæus Crassus formed part of the triumvirate with Pompey and Caesar for his part in helping to fix the 55 BC elections, which allowed Caesar to remain governor of Gaul. Crassus was awarded a 5-year proconsulate of Syria after he finished his consulship in Rome. Crassus made no secret of the fact that he wanted to invade Parthia. Maybe part of this was down to the success that Pompey had had in Iberia and that Caesar had had in Gaul, but part of it was also perhaps down to the fact that he wanted his highly ambitious and highly talented son Publius Crassus to have some success. And what better success to have than to defeat Rome's largest and greatest enemy of the time, Parthia. Using his wealth and joined by Publius's loyal Celtic cavalry, Crassus raised 7 legions, which included 35 heavy infantry, 4,000 light infantry or skirmishers, 4,000 cavalry including Publius's Celts, and 6,000 cavalry from Armenia. Now, the Armenian king offered him a further 16,000 cavalry and 30,000 troops if Crassus would invade Parthia via Armenia. However, Crassus refused and decided to launch his invasion directly. He thought the invasion of Parthia would be easy, and yet it proved anything but. As it happened, the Parthian king Orodes decided to split his forces into 2. He led the larger of the 2 forces north, himself, to attack the Armenians for helping the Romans. While he did this, he gave a smaller skirmish force to his general Serena. Serena's task was to harry, harass, and to delay the Romans long enough for Orodes to beat up the Armenians and come back and deal with the Romans himself. As it turned out, Serena did not require the forces of his king. For some reason, Crassus decided to ignore the advice of his generals and instead opted for an open square formation designed to protect his army from being outflanked. This allowed the Parthian skirmishers to harass and harry his forces using their bows and expert cavalry archers. The Romans hoped to outlast the Parthians by waiting for the Parthians to run out of arrows, but it soon became clear that this would not happen. Publius led a cavalry charge to try and destroy the Parthian cavalry archers, but these cavalry archers were too nimble and well trained. They broke away, feigned a retreat, then came back, surrounded Publius's cavalry and killed them to a man. Eventually, night came and the battle finished. The next day, the Romans threatened mutiny if Crassus did not entreat with Serena. Somehow, Crassus ended up dead and mocked by the end of the day, with his head possibly filled with molten gold to reflect his greed. In addition to Crassus and his son Publius dying, 20,000 Romans were killed. 10,000 were captured as slaves. A further 10,000 under Gaius Cassius Longinus went back to Syria and defended the border against the Parthians. Longinus' actions were to be later praised by Cicero. Later Roman sources state that Pliny believed that the POWs were transported to the eastern part of the Parthian Empire to a city known as Merv. Merv at the time was called Alexandria Margiana, and this would be important later. As it happens, Merv is not too far from Taraz. We hear nothing more of the Romans sent to the east from Roman sources, but we do hear in 36 BC that Mark Antony met a Roman POW wearing Parthian clothing on his own failed invasion of Parthia. 16 years later, in 20 BC, the first Roman emperor, Augustus, negotiated the return of all surviving Roman POWs from these two battles. So let's recap. In 53 BC, 40,000 Roman soldiers invaded Parthia. Only 10,000 returned, 20,000 were killed, and 10,000 were transported to the east of the empire. In 36 BC, there was the Battle of Taraz in modern-day Kazakhstan, where Chinese sources suggest there may have been Roman soldiers, or at least ones employing similar tactics. In the same year, Mark Antony invaded Parthia from the west. It is said that he met one surviving Roman from this battle, though his story is not corroborated by any other sources. 16 years later, Augustus negotiated return of all surviving Romans. There is no mention of any Romans surviving in the east. The city of Alexandria Margiana may actually give us a second explanation for why there is Caucasian DNA in Western China. And in fact, many news outlets and historians have come to the same conclusion. They've come to this conclusion because during the reign of Alexander the Great, it is known that Macedonians and Greeks, in fact, entered eastern Persia. After the Battle of Gaugamela, Alexander began exploring the far reaches of the world as he knew it. This meant going into Uzbekistan and around the Hindu Kush, before going south to try and invade India. As he went through this region, he set up many cities, including garrisons filled with Greeks and Macedonian troops. So it is well known that Greeks were settling in the region. Indeed, one of his successors, Seleucus, who took over modern-day Iran and other eastern regions, found Greeks and Macedonians scattered all across his land. He organised them into garrisons and cities. Therefore, we know there were Caucasians all over the region. As it happens, 80 years later, Qin Shi Huang became the first emperor of all of China in 246 BC, and he unified the kingdom and ruled over it for 37 years, eventually dying in 209 BC. During this period, he strengthened and unified the Han people. He is also most famous for his terracotta army of protectors, with each man's face being unique. This uniqueness has made many people believe that the terracotta warriors and other terracotta figures were modelled after real people who held these roles during the emperor's reign. However, these were the first such life-size sculptures in Chinese history. So historians are now suggesting that Greeks helped the Chinese make these sculptures, and their evidence for this is Caucasian DNA in Western China. While this one is a little bit more plausible, because we know there were plenty of Greeks in the area at the time, and they had the skills to make the sculptures, we do not know if this is the case. There is no historical record saying that the Greeks taught the Chinese to do this. Was it Romans or Greeks? Well, history is a little bit more complicated than that, and we have a little bit more evidence from the DNA that's going to put a fly in this ointment.
We were conducting more research on the people of Liqian. We wanted to know when their ancestors arrived in that area. We found that their ancestors arrived in Liqian about 10,000 years ago. This is much earlier than the time the Roman legion disappeared, which would have been about 2,000 years ago. The people of Liqian came from a long period of intermarriage between Europeans, Africans, and Han Chinese. Although the DNA tests couldn't specifically prove that the people of Liqian are the descendants of the missing legion, it did provide further proof that Europeans and Africans played a role in the development of China's population.
Well, that's a bit different, isn't it? Not 2,000 years ago, not 2,300 years ago, but 8,000 BC, or roughly 10,000 years ago. So it seems the Liqian era and Central Asia in general was for 10,000 years the confluence of peoples coming from the south, the north and the east. We know the Han were to the east as well as other Chinese kingdoms and peoples. To the south were the Persians, Afghans and Indians. But who were to the north? Let's go back to that map. Look who's there in the middle. The Tocharians. Not Targaryens with the gold that we saw earlier, but the Tocharians. The whole region of the Altai Mountains to the north of Liqian and to the west into southern Siberia were filled with Turkic Mongol peoples to the east and Proto-Indo-European and Uralic peoples to the north and west. The Tocharians, like the Medians, who invaded Persia and cultivated the apple, were a Proto-Indo-European people. Around 3,300 BC, they migrated eastwards from the Ukraine to the Altai Mountains, where they formed the Afanasyevo culture. In around 2000 BC, the Tocharians moved into the Tarim and Shaohe basins, which formed the most important overland trade route between China and Central Asia. This route would eventually become the Silk Road. This shows there's been Caucasians in Central Asia for thousands of years, well over 5,000 years at least. However, we're still not down to 8,000 BC, are we? So let's delve into a bit more archaeology this time and see what we can find. Bones found at Ust Ishim, dating from around 45,000 years ago, were of an ancient Homo sapiens Neanderthal mix which had more Neanderthal than modern human. I believe they're both of the same species, but the differences between Neanderthals and humans is for another video. The evidence shows there were peoples, possibly early Caucasians in their region, breeding and mixing long before the DNA of the Liqian Chinese. The Altai region is also home to the fascinating Denisovan bone fragments, which are rewriting the story of human evolution. Finally, we have some evidence of the development of the Proto-Indo-Europeans in that region, but that was 5,000 years ago. In 8,000 BC we know very little, except that the climate was very different then to what it is now, and only a few thousand years beforehand it was even more different. If we think about the climate change in the last 150 years, after the mini ice age finished, and temperatures have risen back to normal, well, almost normal. We're not quite as hot as we were before, but we're getting closer. If we think about that difference, the difference between before 9600 BC and afterwards is unbelievably different. The temperature rose by more than we can possibly imagine, and with it, all the ice melted, and the sea rose by 400 metres to its present levels. This radically reshaped the environment of the entire world. Were the Caucasians living further east in Siberia at this time? What we do know is that there were only 6,000 or so humans in Europe at the time of the Ice Age, with most people living in North Africa, the Middle East, both of which were a lot more inhabitable then than they are now, by the way, or in Asia. So could the Caucasians have gone west into the Ukraine, then back east again? Were they in Siberia the whole time and we just haven't found them yet? Anything's possible. Siberia is pretty damn massive and we could have just missed all the archaeology. Plus, let's think about this seriously. Not much survives for 10,000 years. Do you ever get the feeling that history is complicated? Well, it is. We live in a wonderful world, a world full of mystery, a world where at some point we knew some things, but at no point have we known everything. All we can do is continue to look, discover and think, because Truly, the keys to our past and our history is just beyond the reach of our fingertips. So let's, together, stretch a little bit more and see what we can discover. Thank you for watching.
Look, we came here to see David Lopan, all right?
Ah?
Well, I don't get this at all. I thought Lopan...
Shut up, Mr. Burton. You are not brought upon this world to get it.